Hello. So my name is Florian Berg. I am a research scientist at MIT Sloan, and I started with Professor Rigoborn and Professor Körbel, the Aggregate Confusion project, roughly 7 years ago. And in the beginning, we are really interested in how to actually measure ethical behavior. And ESG certainly is not necessarily ethical behavior, but it's fairly related. And so we actually tried to gather a lot of different ESG ratings. In total, it was 6, and I will show you more about that in a couple of slides. But we found out that those actually they differ a lot, and this is why we actually call the project Aggregate Confusion, because we saw then when we looked at the data that there's a lot of aggregation, and we were just confused all the time. At the time, I have to say, it was also interesting that those ESG raters, they often didn't have any methodology document. So we asked them, actually, can you send us a document to describe how your ESG rating is built? They said, oh, we don't have any, not even an internal one. We just have this Excel file where we fill out things, and then we merge this information. So I spent a lot of time with Julian Körbel traveling to those ESG raters and seeing the analysts and asking them actually how those ESG ratings are built. And what I learned in these conversations and in the following analysis on this data, I will share today. I hope you like it. So it's actually fascinating to see that ESG ratings became sort of standardized in the way they actually, in the high-level construction. There is no body that actually told those ESG raters how an ESG rater should look like. But yet the aggregation follows the same structure. And so on top you have this ESG rating. Then you have then you have the environmental rating, the social rating, and the governance rating. And the environmental rating is then composed of certain topics such as CO2 emissions, water consumption, or waste. And in the social dimension, you have human rights, human capital, supply chain issues. And in the governance dimension, you have board independence, corruption, and taxes, and loads of other business ethics, for example. So first, there's often, when you see actually across the board, actually, and I don't actually know, I just only know one ESG rater that works a little bit differently. But what most of the ESG raters do is that they take a sort of weighted average to create out of those topics, of the E topics, to create an environmental rating. They do the same for the social and the same for the governance rating. Then they take a weighted average to calculate those the overall ESG score. So this is the aggregation that confused us so much that I was talking about. Yeah, what's so interesting, the term ESG was actually coined in 2004 in the Who Cares Wins report. So it's not that long ago, and the way it was seen was a little bit different than it's depicted here. So certainly the company should take care of the environmental and the social dimension. But there was also a governance dimension. And the governance dimension was actually meant to be a little bit on top of the environmental social dimension, because you need functioning governance structures to make sure that the environmental and social issues are taken into account at each level of management. But de facto, how the market developed is that we have now 3 very distinct categories: environmental, social, and governance. And I thought this was actually, it's a fascinating development, because no one imposed it. It was really the market that did it. So what are actually ESG ratings? ESG ratings are an opinion about the environmental, social, and governance performance of a firm. There's the financial materiality, that is risks, that is basically the ratings that look at risks and opportunities. basically risks and opportunities for profit in the end of a company. And then there's the double materiality approach, where they not only look at the financial materiality, so on the risks and opportunities, but also on the impact that the company has on the outside world. But this separation, this is not ever often when we talk about financial materiality and double materiality, and when you read about it in certain legislative texts in Europe, it feels like there's a hard separation, but there's never really a hard separation. It's more like a scale, because something that has an impact or double materiality, for example, impact on communities, if those communities are so unhappy that they go on strike and prevent your factory from working, then it becomes a financial risk. Or if you have child labor in your supply chain and this becomes a massive scandal, then it would be also a financial risk. So there's never a really hard separation. And in de facto, when you look at those ESG ratings, it's more scale. Some ratings tend more to be financial material and some more double material. So who are actually the big players in the space? It's all the financial service, data service providers that you know: Bloomberg, S&P Global, ISS, Refinitiv, Moody's, Morningstar, MSCI. That tells you that those actually, that there's certain a belief that that this data is important. If not, they wouldn't actually have offer ESG data. And most of them, except for Bloomberg, actually bought little startups that started doing ESG ratings. Bloomberg produces the ESG rating in-house, and they really started with the methodology. But S&P Global bought Rebecca Sam, Refinitiv bought Asset4, Moody's bought Visio Iris, Morningstar bought Sustainalytics, ISS bought Ökom, and MSCI through Riskmetrics bought KLD and Innovest. Those ESG ratings, they differ a lot in terms of topics that they look at. Some ESG raters looks at 35 topics, others up to 186. And this difference, this heterogeneity between methodologies, translates also in different outcomes. So you have a lot of divergence or disagreement between those raters. And here we took actually 900 out of the 924 companies in our sample that are common between those 6 raters that we looked at. We actually just graphed those companies where they agree the most and those companies where they disagree the most. The disagreement, so we rescale it and it's expressed in standard deviations. But basically what it means is that the difference between -2 standard deviations and 2 standard deviations positive is the difference from very bad to very good. You see it here indicated with the arrows. So in the highest disagreement bracket, all those companies are basically a difference between very good and very bad. A -4 would be then extremely bad, and +4 would be extremely good. Where the highest disagreement is, you see that the difference is actually, they're all fairly close. And so when we observed that in the beginning of our analysis, we asked ourselves, what's driving this disagreement, this divergence? So we analyzed it statistically and looked at if it's different industries, because maybe there's an industry that's harder to assess. Maybe industrials are harder to assess than tech companies, or the opposite. But we couldn't actually see any difference. As a matter of fact, on the left, you see Apple, and on the right, you see Intel. Fairly similar companies in terms of industry. You also, geographically, there was no difference. So it was actually very fascinating. But you could actually tell there's differences in the methodology. And one point where you actually see it very clearly is Philip Morris International. 5 raters give it an average rating, and 1 rater says, no, this is an extremely bad company. And when you go actually into the methodology, you see that this one rater punished Philip Morris for having a toxic product, cigarettes. And this toxic product, the others didn't punish Philip Morris for its toxic product that much. So since we also don't really have the ground truth, so we don't really know, I can't tell you which rater is right. So the only thing actually in this case I can do is I can compare them, and that's what we did. And so we actually set out to statistically explain why they come to a different agreement, or why there's so much disagreement in this space. And therefore, basically 4 distinct reasons. This first is the rating more focused on financial or double materiality. Then it's measurement. I want to measure the same topic, let's say product safety, but I come to completely different conclusions because I use different methodology and I use different data as inputs. Then, as you saw, there's a lot of the scope. The fact that I integrate certain topics or not. As I said, some raters look at 35, others are 186. So that will naturally also create disagreement. And then last but not least, the weighting, the relative importance. For some raters, CO2 emissions for a certain company are more important, and for others, it's occupational health and safety. So those are actually the reasons why they diverge, and I will walk you now through this. Let's go back a little bit to the financial materiality and double materiality. So let's assume Nestle has a bottling plant in India and they take out water out of the ground. And so now they take a little bit more water than actually what is coming back. And it's a very dry area. It's a desert that's close to a desert. And so the water cannot come back that they take out. So this will obviously pose a risk to their profit, because if they don't have water in the ground, they can't bottle it. So they will not be able to sell it. So this is the financial materiality aspect. Then the impact materiality here would be that certainly the bottling plant doesn't have enough water, but the communities around, they're also deprived of water. So that would actually then have an impact on the communities around, on the outside world of the company. And this is what we call then impact materiality. Together, this is what is double materiality. In terms of ESG raters, that means they're not perfectly correlated, but there's still some correlation, because the source of stress or the source of the problem, the water stress, is the same. So both indicators will correlate somewhat, even though they're philosophically fairly different. And when you classify ESG raters now according to financial materiality and double materiality, is that on the hard end of the financial materiality, it's MSCI and Sustainalytics. And MSCI is an American data provider. They made the choice to be purely financial material in 2013-14. Sustainalytics actually got bought by Morningstar and made this choice in 2018-2019. They had a double materiality approach, but became then financial material. The others, S&P Global, ISS, Refinitiv, and Moody's, they actually more follow a double materiality approach. And this is also because they were all European. It's really also philosophically the US financial material and Europe double material sort of difference in philosophy. And I will show you later, it's the financial materiality approach that is actually taking over, which also makes sense in some ways. So now one of the most important sources of disagreement between those ESG raters is this different measurement approaches, because all those raters, they, for example, want to measure the same thing, such as CO2 emissions or physical climate change risks, but they will use different data. Because there's a wealth of data, but there's also a lack of data at the same time. the firms disclose nowadays a lot of data. I mean, every company in the S&P literally virtually has a sustainability report. But when you read those sustainability reports, they're often very unstructured, or they're not often, they're always unstructured. And it's hard actually to really figure out what the true climate risk performance, or how they actually take into account, or how they build up resilience against physical climate change risks. And I don't know if you've ever read those, but they're often, in those sustainability reports, there are often a lot of pictures of smiling kids, of really beautiful forests. And yeah, it feels like sort of sometimes like going on a vacation reading that, but it's not necessarily instructive. Then there's a lot of structured data that firms disclose, and that's through firm disclosure frameworks such as GRI or SASB, ISSB. This is more in the sense that it's more structured, where actually you have with GRI or SASB, you have a sort of content index. And in this content index, they say, okay, we disclose emissions, and the emissions you find on page 22 in the sustainability report. So it helps you very quickly to find actually all the information you want. Then those ESG raters, they use also government data, World Bank data, for example. They use SEC filings in the case of the US, so financial reports. In the case, I will show you the case of Tesla, an excerpt of the 10K there, so the financial filing, the yearly filing with the SEC, where they clearly reference some ESG risks. And then they also use media controversies. And in the end, if the data is not available, they model the data. We call it data imputation, where you often conditional on the industry. You kind of take the industry average in absence of CO2 emissions data. That all are assumptions. Also, media controversies have biases, because media sometimes has a sort of agenda, like they also have sometimes preferences to talk about certain topics and others not. And so all this has actually certain biases, and so there are all assumptions behind it. And so the data that you choose will lead to a certain outcome, will influence your outcome, your rating. And so different data points, different outcomes. And so this takes me actually to a little bit the purpose of an ESG rater, because I think the purpose of an ESG rater changed dramatically in the last 20 years. The earliest ESG raters, such as KLD, that got bought by MSCI and discontinued, they were actually in Refinitiv, for example. They were mostly data gatherers, because at the time it was very difficult to gather that data. You had to go through unstructured sustainability reports, you had to read for annual reports, 10Ks, and really make your opinion about the company. But nowadays, with large language models and natural language processing, and in particular in 2027, Europe will have the single access point, where every company has to upload their sustainability information that is closed in sustainability information, and this is mandatory, the disclosure and the upload. It will be very easy to create a rating or to have that information. So ESG raters will be forced to be more than actually just data gatherers. And you can already see this. And it's important, because if you, for example, disclose data, let's assume that a company discloses data about sexual harassment cases. And now let's assume that in the company you see a sudden rise in sexual harassment cases. Does that mean that the company is better or worse? You can't really tell, because maybe now they're actually just doing better. You remember Uber, the case with Uber. They actually fired their CEO because there was a massive problem with sexual harassment cases. But the minute they fired the CEO, they should have deserved a better rating, because that's where actually they were doing something about it. But that's also the time when the sexual harassment cases, the observation actually shot up. And so this is actually what I mean with you have to put all ESG data in general, you have to put in context. So this contextuality is really important. Also with pollution. If you pollute upstream and then the pollution goes into the city, that's much worse than downstream. So in this, the company would probably just disclose the pollution in general. But to put that in context, we need an ESG rater. Same with intentionality. For example, you observe the CO2 emissions, but what does it actually mean? CO2 emissions, headline CO2 emissions, they might be low, they might be high, but actually what's really important is that the company does something about it, makes a reasonable effort to reduce them in the future, engages, for example, in research and development, to change operations of the factories, and so to reduce CO2 emissions. So really, for me, the raison d'etre of an ESG rating agency is this intentionality and this contextuality. And then I told you about the scope and the weights, what we call in our paper the scope and weights divergence. So this is really the choice and the relative importance of indicators. Again, here is financial materiality and double materiality is really important, because maybe one indicator is just more about financial materiality, another indicator is more about impact materiality. But it's also and that also would define how relative important the indicator is. Are CO2 emissions more important than DI or not for a certain company? Those are all choices to be made. And there are also personal preferences in there. For example, Moody's ESG Solutions bought Vigeo Eiris. And Vigeo Eiris was founded by the president of a labor union, a French labor union. And so when you look at the methodology, you actually can see there's disproportionate amount of data about labor practices and human rights issues. So those personal preferences of the person that started the company, actually, you can still see until it was disbanded. Moody's is actually disbanded now, the ESG Solutions part. And there's also cultural differences. In Thailand, you must be very much aware of that. Those de facto standards of how to assess a company, the ESG factors, are more or less determined in Europe and in the US, and that can create problems because maybe you have other different best practices. There's, for example, one of the first countries that ratified an ESG rating regulation is India, and they put in the appendix that if you want to sell a rating in India, then you have to take into account rural development. So you have to change your methodology. Some raters, large raters, were very unhappy about this, and they discontinued to sell data in India, unfortunately. They did not want to adjust, and that is a problem. But you also observe in those data sets that sometimes companies in Asia, they just have worse ratings. And that might be because they're just seen culturally through a lens that is not appropriate for those companies. And that is certainly, I think, one of the major issues of ESG in general, that it's defined in the West. And last but not least, your choice will also depend on relative importance of indicators issues will also depend on the trust in the data. If you don't really trust in the data, you might not integrate it and different ESG raters will have different thresholds of how much trust they have in the data. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the construction of ESG ratings. And there are actually some problems with it. And here's an example of Tesla, an official SEC filing of Tesla. Tesla is by far the biggest leader not by far the biggest leader, but it is the absolute leader in green tech, in opportunities in green tech, so to say, in ESG speech. They're the largest company of electronic vehicles in the US. But they have some problems with labor treatment and also with governance. And they even tell it yourself. You just read their official SEC filing and it says if we are unable to attract, hire, and retain key employees and qualified personnel, our ability to compete may be harmed. The loss of the services of any of our key employees or any significant portion of our workforce could disrupt our operations or delay the development, introduction, and ramp of our products and services. In particular, we are highly dependent on the services of Elon Musk, the techno king of Tesla and our chief executive officer. Yes, you heard right. He calls himself the techno king of Tesla. I remember still the tweet he put out, and when someone said, hey, why don't you call yourself techno king of Tesla? And he just did. And now his title is actually not the CEO anymore. It's just techno king of Tesla. That tells you there's already a governance issue, and they're very much aware of it. They're really scared of Elon Musk actually leaving the country, the company. And you see that for MSCI, you see that it's a leader in opportunities in clean tech, and it's an average in corporate governance and corporate behavior, and it's an ESG laggard in product safety and quality. There were a lot of recalls of the cars, and in labor management, and yet it has a good rating. But how can you compensate one being a leader in one aspect and just being average in the other aspect, or even a laggard? Or put differently, how can you compensate for fossil fuel company oil spills with discrimination? That from a risk perspective, that doesn't make any sense. If you use ESG rating as a measure of risk, it absolutely doesn't make any sense. And you can see that here in the case study of Tesla. When Elon Musk bought Twitter, it went down. And when he announced to buy Twitter, then it went up a little again because everyone thought maybe he doesn't do it. And then when he announced it again, it rushed down again. And this is what you read in the 10K. If he focuses attention on elsewhere, then Tesla, the share price will suffer, or Tesla as a company. And an ESG rating should capture those things, but it's obviously hard when you can compensate with opportunities in clean tech. Yeah, and I think this makes it, that doesn't mean that the information is not important, because when you go on the lower level, on the issue level, then it will actually tell you a real story. What I question is really this aggregation and putting directly into a portfolio. That doesn't mean the aggregated ESG rating. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't you shouldn't look at the ESG rating, because a low ESG rating might tell you that across the board the company is bad, and then this allows you actually to look a little bit deeper what the issue is. But you certainly have to be aware of the issue level data, and it's not enough to just look at the high level ESG rating, for sure. So which raters matter actually in the S? Unfortunately, I don't have any data on the Thai market, but in the S, it's clearly MSCI. We correlated stock holdings of all ESG mutual funds with the ESG ratings, and we see it's basically MSCI. And it's really getting stronger and stronger, the correlation with fund holdings. In Europe, the picture is a little bit different. It's also MSCI that's taking over slowly, but you also have ISS, the green one here, that's fairly strong. Yeah, this is actually, you can tell that this is actually, and it makes sense when you also look at sustainability reports, the story of financial materiality is slowly also taking over in Europe much more. So do actually those ESG ratings matter is now the question. So we did actually, because in the ESG ratings, the only ESG rating that correlates with holdings is MSCI. So we actually looked at MSCI ESG rating changes and then how that impacts investor holdings. And when there's an upgrade of MSCI rating, the investor holdings in that company go up. And when there's a downgrade, they go down. What's so interesting here, actually, in this graph is that it takes up to 24 months for financial actors to integrate the rating changes in their portfolios. If you truly believe the story of financial performance, you would act much faster. Wouldn't take you 24 months. So it seems that those ratings are more used as to fulfill a compliance issue or a mandate. And those fund managers are very much interested in reducing the turnover of their portfolio. And you see the similar pattern actually with when you look at returns and market cap increases if the ESG rating goes up by one notch and it increases by 2.2%, and then market cap decreases by 2.3% within 24 months. And you see that temporally it correlates very much. So it seems that it's really a demand-driven question. Investors buy the stock, so that's why you see the stock price going up. So what are the policy implications now? Should we standardize ESG ratings? No, absolutely not, because we would only we would create perverse incentives. Because if we don't know how to measure something perfectly, why would we standardize it? If everyone then has the same measure, yes, there's no disagreement, but it doesn't mean at all that we have good data. What we need is to maximize the signal in the noise. So I'm absolutely pro standardizing ESG disclosure, firm level ESG disclosure, because we need to have the same metrics, right? If we measure CO2 emissions differently, then if there's no disagreement, then there's a problem. But the interpretation of what the company actually does with those CO2 emissions, that cannot be standardized. That's an opinion. And what we need to is to maximize the signal. So we need to actually set the incentives right. That's why we need ESG rating regulation. So there's more competition about providing a better signal. And the way we do it is, I think, and there is the Indian and the European ESG rating regulation is very good at that. And I had also quite a lot of conversations with the regulators in Europe there, that transparency and accountability is the most important part. So transparency, the ESG raters have to make their methodologies, at least in parts, public. They have to explain what they're doing, because only then I can criticize them, and only then I know what I buy. And then I can decide after my due diligence which rater and which methodology I prefer. But there's also accountability, and that is companies reaching out to those ESG raters and are able to complain that they may be misperceived. Because there are plenty of examples, in particular, for example, Asian companies that might be perceived in an unfavorable way because they don't follow American best practices, but for example, Asian or Thai best practices. And so if they then can go to the ESG rater and say, hey, look, we are actually much better than you think because of this and this and this. And then if the ESG rater has to listen to them and has to adapt their methodology, then there might be actually some upward, some improvement of the signal in there. Of course, the rater has to have the last say in this. It's only when the firm has a reasonable objection to the methodology that it should be heard, or if there's a data error. So again, I think if there should be a policy for sure in place for ESG ratings, and that should be centered around transparency and accountability. And I hope that you enjoyed my talk today, and I hope you enjoyed actually, I could transmit you some of my research findings, and I hope you find it useful. Thank you for having me.